In this video, I'm going to be philosophizing on anarchism, concerned mostly with human rights and or freedoms, liberating the self for the self as a must be good enough in necessarily necessary conditions, voluntary suffering and or responsabilidade é empreendido para a cultivação de liberdade dentro do autor, to conduct more liberally one's affairs appropriately without the infringement of rights and freedoms upon another individual whom holds the sanctity within one's intrinsic being to be more sacred concerning one's privacy and or individual autonomy, to mean any violation of one's intrinsic individual autonomy and or privacy uniquely in the individual free agents who appropriately treat and or engage responsible, meaningful conduct, never misconduct and or inappropriate misconducts to inflict disproportionate, unequitable harm upon the self and or others whom are in need of treatment, not governance per se, as it's expected individuals undertake the responsible temperance in order to engage the appropriate tempering of one's conduct to not result in crimes and or hospitalizations from engaging self-harm, inflicting more serious injury upon engaging certain misconducts compared to the proportionate, possible probabilistic, minor threat and or harm and or injury trivial to constitute misconducts and or inappropriate conducts needing certain medical and or criminal interventions to treat individuals whom are suffering from criminality and or certain psychiatric illnesses compared to individuals whom are responsible agents whom engage more valientemente o expectado e apropriadamente conduzem a direção de optimizando valência para o mais nobre conduz uma poder valorizar, engajando unicamente o valorizações de uma poder engajando o anarquismo mais apessoço para conduz os negociações appropriate for one to temper one's responsible conduct, engajando o trabalho ético with the valiance to allowance for more courteous prudence within one's introspections prior to engaging meaningful utterances of thought, with the appropriate duty of care having meaningfully endured the time invested within the labors of often what exhausts the expenditures within one's livagência to consume the necessary resources within one's estar para cultivar o liberdade passando, within consuming often the meaningful practical wisdom transcribed within the textos de livros o livros escrito ser o iluminação pensadores, whom are liberating the minds of individuals within the literature one consumes information in the consumption of information ingested from the retinal perspectival processing of sensory information from sensor inputs that are translated into distinct ingestions, consuming sets of meaningful information within the corpus of one's self, engaging the direct and or indirect preceptors meaningful to allowance for direct perception navigations, yet it is the direct and or indirect percepts of self most meaningful to allowance the interpolation and or extrapolation from the inferences into one's direct perception, perceiving distinct informations one incurs within the cultivations of what is so meaningful within the more valued illumination writings communicated within the Enlightenment works of Enlightenment thinkers, whom are the illuminaries and whom are illuminous in terms of illuminating the injustices that are what violate individual autonomy and or privacy, to cultivate awareness in the individual free agents around them, to have been so meaningful in terms of their contributions to society from being most meaningful to the individuals around them. Primeiro, para a cultivação de prático sabedoria. Isto mesadas o primeiro perspectival ingestions of what's most meaningful for one's consumption of more valorized depths of practical wisdom that one may engage responsibly. The hours of consuming Enlightenment works concerning distinct sciences and or the writings of philosophy, philosophize contributing most to the advancing of human rights and or freedoms. In more contemporaneous writings, there are more, yet still few individuals whom I have cited throughout distinct blogs, and including my first book on synthetic meaning concerning the psychological enlightenment, whom were the illuminaries of subjective well-being and whom provide practical knowledge into what you may conduct within your more responsible undertakings, and uniquely the responsible undertakings, not to somehow beget the wisdom one thinks one will have, thinking that merely consuming the Enlightenment texts is good enough, yet does not satisfy the necessarily necessary conditions meaningful to consume as a must be good enough and necessarily necessary conditions, practical wisdom inferred within iluminação textos do livros, uma ingerir para o consumo de informação, processos iluminado o existem previews para o corrente para futuro orientado, cultivações de temperado conduz mais a pessoa para uma engajando o liberação de anarquismo dentro o liberdade passando, temperate to the conducts having ingested what is practical and extrapolating from practical information ingested what one may responsibly conduct from the appropriate duty of care one consumes to satisfy the necessarily necessary conditions more meaningfully, not merely from the ingestions without the appropriate consumption of information, carefully consuming what's meaningful with cuidado para o distinto, unique, diretamente e o indiretamente associativo, analítico a pessoa interpretações para uma ingerir apropriadamente o prático sabedoria uma poderá conduz derivando o apropriado perspectivo to allowance for more responsible future-oriented conducts as a more responsible free-thinking citizen and or individual whom contributes mostly to the individuals around them with some expectation of civility, not necessarily the thinking of what is most meaningful to engage the people pleasing within governance, as anarchism is against and or incompatible intrinsically with a state and the impositions of often what is the ideologue's irrationality within the reasons ideologues provide in terms of faulty evidence for justifying, not truly justifying, yet providing the reasons within the faux justifications that do not excuse the injustices of government claiming to provide more human rights and or freedoms, yet infringe individual autonomy and or privacy more than what is necessary to appropriately treat criminality and or individuals whom are more harm to themselves and or others who are of most meaningful concern resultant from the misconducts and or inappropriate thinking within superstitions and or supernaturalisms most responsible for the dogmatism and or misconducts directly and or indirectly resultant from dogmatisms, assuming one holds perfect and or absolute self-knowledge and or self-awareness, yet are the individuals whom lack the most self-knowledge and or self-awareness amongst the clearest thinking, with the most vagnesses within one's direct perception, failing often the self and or thinking one is conducting oneself more meaningfully in the direction of a utopic vision, yet often engages deliberate self-harm and or avoidance of what is more the difficult burden to endure on the road to liberation, engaging the responsible conducts to engage responsible thinking, reading the extraordinary works of extraordinary luminaries who are the Enlightenment thinkers and are the individuals within the psychological Enlightenment, including William James, and or whom tend to be more concerned with engaging meaningfully a elaborate and the most best meaning interpretation calibrations one may, in terms of the best thinking one may do within psychology, should be to read Wilhelm Wundt's Principles of Psychophysiological Psychology, to concern themselves with subjectivo-objectivo relacionáveis incipient original instantiations amongst the what is unique to his philosophizing voluntarism, meaningful to understand the appropriateness of developing one's self-knowledge and or self-awareness into psychological science, informing human rights and or freedoms from how certain mind-body connections connect certain, as I have originally instantiated, reciprocal relations to infer what is more meaningful from meaningful similarities, not necessarily as Wilhelm Wundt has instantiated parallelisms, as I do tend to hold more unique distinctions with my approach to philosophizing on mind-body connections compared to Wilhelm Wundt, whom has originally instantiated the best work in terms of originating thinking in terms of what constitutes meaningful subjetivo-objetivo relacionáveis dentro o mente-corpo conexões, meaning that the mind-body connections are not merely arbitrary to constitute subjective knowledge. They tend to draw from these stimuli within the external environment connected to the stimulations within the nervous system, calibrated within direct perception to constitute the distinct subjectivo-objectivo relationships within mind-body connections that allowance for meaningful conduct. One may engage volitional cognizance to appropriately improve certain internal and or external conditions, be it he tended to be more influenced from what was his profession and also the bulk within his contemporaneous philosophizing, more concerned with treating psychiatric illnesses that tended to be the most severe, including schizophrenia and, or in some cases, more serious depression, yet more concerned with psychotic illnesses and or disorders and or other mental illness, to treat more appropriately and not necessarily always medicate those treatments, to infer objectivity within inferences of one's conducts, and to distinguish conducts from misconducts harming the self and or others, to prevent and or mitigate harm, be it that the thinking in terms of mitigation as the most meaningful inclusion criteria amongst the most meaningful inclusion criteria, foremost in where it is appropriate and or relevant, is prevention. Yet in many cases prevention is impossible, so the best second is mitigation, and to reduce the harm one may inflict, to prioritize in some situations well-defined clear communications on the mitigation most probabilistic, be it that prevention is impossible. And in some cases, certain preventative measures are allowance from engaging the mitigating appropriate treatment that allowance for more probabilistic treatment options as one engages the appropriate duty of care within the undertaking of voluntary suffering e o responsabilidade, nunca o desnecessariamente condições, unicamente o necessariamente necessário condições. In English, this means never undertaking the unnecessarily unnecessary conditions, and uniquely the necessarily necessary conditions, meaningful for the appropriate duty of care within the responsible conducts that allowance for one to engage creative thinking and or liberations of one's own mind, within the allowance of engaging in a higher quantity of quantifiable conducts. What defines creativity and or creative problem solving. You could brainstorm generating many distinct, unique, workable working solutions drawn from certain existing meaningful similarities from the problems and or certain existing prior meaningful similarities to the solutions for those problems. One may allowance for the appropriation and or originality to build from what has worked and or what's most likely to work from informed practical wisdom that allowances for one to engage more ethical free thinking and the work ethic necessarily necessary to allowance for one to truly be an individualist anarchist and not necessarily have to rely on others whom are the totalitarians, more likely to result in one's own chronic illnesses and or superstitions and or paranoia derived from the superstitions and the supernaturalisms, from the gaps in meaningful information one may not fill if one is not the one whom is conducting one's thinking and conducting one's clear thinking. To conduct one's clear thinking is to fill in gaps in meaningful information appropriately, to be more able to engage meaningfully within one's internal and or external environment, to be of value and or contribute values meaningful to society volitionally. Within the volitionalism I have originally instantiated to mean that it's the volitional, willful conducts one conducts from the anarchism within one's intrinsic being to engage uniquely the responsible conducts, never irresponsible misconducts, as one truly loses their intrinsic anarchism and is subjugated to the state and or the totalitarians whom provide them the dogmas to think and coerce them into thinking one needs to do X, and yet conducting X is a misconduct that inflicts more harm on one's own subjective well-being and or others, compared to resolving one's own problems for oneself and or communicating clearly to engage the cooperators, never the defactors, whom, including defactors in this explanation for what constitutes a benefactor. Uniquely, it's the cooperators we want to allowance the benefactor self-consumption of the benefits, not the defector, whom is the individual whom tends to be the totalitarian and or experiencing certain chronic diseases from engaging troublemaking and or misconducts resulting in crimes and criminality that is harmful to the self and or others, that to those around one inflicts threat and or harm and or injury, worsening subjective well-being, compared to the illuminations of often individuals engaged in knowledge work. Most meaningfully tend to be professors and or psychologists and or in some cases the best teachers you have in high schools and schools that provide high quality education to individuals to liberate their minds, to think for themselves and engage more responsible conducts. Yet it's the professors and psychologists who tend to most allowance individuals to engage more the wisdom from the psychological enlightenment to optimize one's own self-care appropriately to satisfy volitionally one's relevant and or meaningful, unique psychological need appropriate for the satisfactions within the distinct momentary encounters one experiences within the momentaryism of one's experiences, experiencing the momentariness most meaningful for allowancing the optimisms within one's subjective well-being to build on what works and or what allowances the okayness one experiences within engaging healthy psychological functioning self-care, liberating the mind-body connections of the self for the self by the self, whom is most responsible for the self and is uniquely responsible to satisfy most underlying psychological needs, not to expect, be it one may, that another always satisfies certain underlying psychological needs, often abusing others and or engaging in certain misconducts that tend to drain another as a social vampire whom is harmful and often most likely to result in others resenting an individual, not to excuse another's resentments, as it's often the individual whom is resenting the other whom is inappropriately also engaging in misconducts themselves to inappropriately exacerbate anger within the ineffectivenesses and or inefficiencies within coping that engage maladaptive coping strategies that result in resentment, compared to individuals whom have a more tempered anger and or are more able to integrate healthy proactive responses to anger, not reactivity, as it's reactivity that tends to be one of the best indicators one is more likely to experience resentments, not necessarily responding with the appropriate responsiveness to distinct situations to identify and or to focus on what the issue is, to explain clearly what the issue is and or what about the issue is problematic and or what are the actionable conducts one may conduct to resolve the issue with a step-by-step meaningful approach to optimize the intercategorical and or intercategorical effectivenesses and or inefficiencies, dialing down the volume on the intercategorical and or intercategorical ineffectivenesses and or inefficiencies to allowance for the best creative solutions to distinct issues one experientially encounters within the momentariness one encounters them, to allowance for more optimums within one's subjective experience, more meaningful to liberate the minds of individuals whom desire to be liberated and or necessitate the needs to one's liberties within the liberations, engaging the responsible consumptions of information within consuming the appropriate and the best extraordinary texts written by the best thinkers on certain self-care practices and or human rights and or freedoms concerning the most influential works of the Enlightenment period and or also the most meaningful works contributing to the most practical self-care conducts that you often see on bestseller lists. Yet not all bestsellers are the best books and books that you should consume, meaning that you should find a thought leader whom is wiser in terms of providing like a top 10 list of the best books whom have contributed practically to influencing one's unique thinking, and perhaps consuming 3 to 6 of those books, allowances for you to engage your own liberations of your own thinking, to engage the discovery process, to liberate your own mind of what you learn on your unique journey, training the responsible conducts from the endeavoring towards a more meaningful existência para cultivar o valorização de umas passando, liberating one's being in the endeavors one engages the appropriate responsible tempering of one's conducts and or avoiding and or recognizing in the self and or others the misconducts, to provide elaborate response to in the future avoid engaging those misconducts and or treat those misconducts, often avoiding the conducts and not having to be associated with those misconducts. Yet in some cases one experiences indignation as they may not be able to escape those misconducts within the situation one experientially encounters, perhaps having their individual autonomy and or privacy violated. Most individuals experience the meaninglessness and the arbitrariness and the pointlessnesses within the exponentially frustrating absurdities of existencia. Has one not the will to engage the anger appropriately, to temper one's ziraiva, to allowance for the more meaningful exerioso para o conduz uma voluntariamente mesadas o response to more indignant conducts from the indignations one is fueled to engage the appropriate problem solving and or conflict resolution, allowancing for one to engage more liberdade dentro umas persona, to allowance for the extension of one's extensor mind muscles into oneself, to integrate the healthy psychological functioning responses from the more meaningful cultivation subsequent to what one has no control over and what is inflicted upon the self, to engage more meaningful conducts one does have control and may conduct meaningfully within the future-oriented direction to liberate the self towards the optimisms and or positivities derived from the intrinsic existing nature of anarchism within one's being, connecting to what's most sacred. That's all I want to say for this video. Hope you have an awesome week. Keep those episodes.